Isiamnisiaya, I Tinishqualawan, Quickwitsnalatst, Antasitia Amasialia, the Mana Queth, Synthalia, Ian Ansakalot, the Amoth, the Amoth Queth, Ansakalot Islahotiam, Meetsap, Quidwillum, Tinatamoch, Tinahwelmoch, Tsleil-Waututh, Humathquiam, Is Gohomoshoth. Greetings to our honored guests and my dear ones. I have good feelings in my heart to see all of you today. In our language called Dunriver Hankamitnum, I told you my names. I'm Sitia Ama Sialia. I'm the daughter of Ernie and Deanna George. Ernie is our hereditary chief. I'm the granddaughter, we are the granddaughters of Hereditary Chief Tsleil-Waututh, John L. George, and late John L. George, and late Lillian George, and Tana Shayeth. This is my older sister, Ansakalot Staflot. It's my older sister, Carleen Thomas. We're welcoming you here today to this event, and we're very happy and privileged to be joining you. As we go about our day, our days, coming days, we'd like to remember and hold special in our hearts our friends and relatives that are the Mi'kmaq on the East Coast and the struggle for recognition of defined rights. We want to keep them in our hearts and support them in all ways that we can. We're also thinking of our Haudenosaunee relatives and the struggles for recognition of their land. We're keeping them special in our hearts and helping in all ways that we can. And closer to home are our relatives, the Wet'suwet'en, and the struggle that they're facing, asking all of us to think about these Indigenous people in the struggles that they face, because each one of us as Indigenous people in this room face the same. We might not be facing down DFO or the federal government that is or isn't there, but we are facing down the racism the systemic racism that exists in this world. Each one of us that's Indigenous, we understand that. We can relate to it. You only have to look to the to south of the border, where they're wrapping up their days-long presidential election, and CNN had on one of their broadcasts the exit poll where it said white, black, Latino, and something else. Well, we were the something else. And talk about erasure of Indigenous people to the land. But I don't know if you have it on your Twitter feed or your Facebook feed, but all the Indig I know are making jokes about it. Well, my grandma always said I was something else, and she did. She did say we were something else, right? And they talk about, well, just go look on your Facebook, and that's what the joke is about. And that's because we're like that. We think about things in terms of humor because we've been through so much. And if we don't laugh, we cry. And like that other thing on Facebook 10 or so years ago, ain't nobody got time for that. We have work to do. And we recognize that. And we see it in each other when when it was pre-COVID, and it will be again post-COVID, when we see each other and we can support each other in all the work that each one of you is doing for yourself, for your family, for your people. We just have to hang in. COVID's not going to last forever, and it's not our first rodeo. Like, our people have been through pandemics, and Carleen is going to talk about some of the things that our people have been through. But it's not uncommon. It's what happened to your people as well. And in all of our languages, one of the things that our late grandfather used to say is that we're human beings. Before, we're human beings. And we have to remember that in a world that's forgotten how to be a human being. Maybe things will be different now. I hope so. But what is the true one constant is that we are the same. We are the same in our understanding. We are the same in the trauma that we've all faced, and that our parents and our grandparents and all of our people before us, that they faced. It's our job to face that trauma, to turn it around so that our children don't live with that, so that our children can be the hualmok that they're meant to be. Hualmok in our language is the human being, the indigenous person. I used to think that we were in a time of transition, that we were moving from one place to another. But I see what we were in. We were in a moment of transformation. We are becoming what we are meant to be. And we are meant to be human beings without trauma. We are meant to be humans that love each other. We're meant to be human beings in a world where there is clean air, where there's clean water, where there is enough food, where there's enough medicine. That's what we're all meant to be. And I'm looking forward to seeing our collective transformation. Thanking all of you.
As each people came into being, they were put on a land that looks like them, and given a language that sounds like that land, describes that land in relationship to all those things. As each thing came into being, it was given its own ceremony. So that's how we know our relatives. And when we know all those things, we know how to do our ceremonies to keep the balance between those things.
I'm so excited. I'm so excited that I get to sit here and witness, and I see many people in the audience that have been here throughout the whole time, and witnessing all the different stories. And I'm so excited. Last night we had people, we had Musqueam. And so it's so wonderful to have the two of you and your time. And I don't want to take any time from that, because everything I wanted to talk about, you've already talked about, except for one question, because I know where we're going. But what's one of the biggest gifts from your ancestors? One of the gifts that you've been given?
For me, the gift is the ability to remember our family tree and our history. I'm the sister that people call up and say, oh, should my son be dating her? Aren't we related? But I'm also the one that people call when they want to talk about names and parts of our family.
Beautiful, thank you.
I'm not really sure what the gift is that I've been given, but what the work that I do is so fulfilling, and I know it's something that our grandparents and our parents do, and that's just continue talking about us, continue teaching people about Tsleil-Waututh, because as you heard my sister Leah talk about, full erasure of a people from a continent is incredible. And our late great-grandfather, stood strong. And he said, if I do that, Tsleil-Waututh will lose our voice. And we were just a small people, but smaller people than we are now. We're still pretty small. We're just about 600 in population. And so I think my gift is to be able to just keep sharing our story, sharing our history.
Beautiful. It kind of every day changes on how this rolls out, which is exciting to be a part of this. And so I'm going to we're going to start. You have a slideshow.
Yeah.
And a presentation. So we'll just
Sure.
go right into that.
Okay. Yeah, so we're kind of, this is what I do for my job. I work for the Treaty Lands Resource Department for the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. And part of my job is to do this type of outreach. So this slideshow that I'm showing is what I lovingly call TWN 101, and it's stories, histories of our family woven into the reason why we do the work that we do at the Nation. So you will get personal anecdotes, but also how it's so connected to why we do the work that we do. We call it a backgrounder up here, and the photo on the title slide is a photo of our late uncle, Herb George Tewalton, and that is his dog, Jubilee, and they are up in the Indian River. So when we first started out in the Treaty Lands Resource Department, Terry Tobias wrote a book called Chief Carey's Moose, and it was about this Chief Carey, and it was a mapping story about mapping, and that's the work that they do. And he came in touch with Tsleil-Waututh and heard about our Uncle Herb's story, and he decided to include Uncle Herb's story as one of his chapters of the book that is called Chief Carey's Moose Too. Yeah, it's called something else though. I'm sorry, I can't remember it. So Terry had our Uncle Herb took Terry up into the Indian River, and he just collected a lot of stories and a lot of experience with our uncle. And you can't really see it very well, but there's a spent out salmon in the river, and Uncle Herb's trying to keep Jubilee away from that because, as you know, dogs, they love to roll around in stinky stuff. Next slide. So you've heard, we've been here since time immemorial, or time out of mind. And actually the first time I heard of time out of mind is when my sister was doing this kind of work before I took it on. And for me, time out of mind means since the oldest living memory, our people have been here. And this map is what we submitted to the Treaty Commission when Tsleil-Waututh decided to enter into the BC Treaty process back in the early 90s, and it's based on our oral history. And the reason why it was important to have Terry Tobias to do this work as well, because you know, maps tell stories, and in the Winitum way or in the government way, you know, once you draw a line on a map, that's it, that's the truth. Ain't got no room for anybody else's truth. So it was really important for Tsleil-Waututh to have our story told our way. We didn't enter into the treaty process right away. It was the very last day, the very last hour that we submitted our application, because we were of two minds. First, we felt that it was a conversation that we would be having government to government, so with the federal government of Canada and our leadership of the Tsleil-Waututh. BC was brought in because of the simple fact, you know, our people happen to live in the province of British Columbia. And so, anyway, it took us a long time to get to a consensus about entering into the process or not. Once we did, we decided it was important to have our oral history documented as much as possible. And I believe Leah and our former Chief Justin and Damien George were our first cohort who were trained to take that type of knowledge, recording it and eventually archiving it. So you can see on the slide that what our territory is, and that pre-contact we numbered in the tens of thousands. Currently, like I shared earlier, we're at we've grown up to about 600. Next slide, please. So you heard Leah share with you our ancestors, and it's so important. And what Kim, we were talking about prior to starting our conversation here is how we're tied to the land. And we've been brought up knowing that Tsleil-Waututh comes from this land. Our very first grandfather was transformed from a wolf to a human being. Our very first grandmother was transformed from the sediment of the inlet into our first grandmother. So we carry that shahalmas. My sister found that word from a relative of ours on the island. It means sacred obligation. We take that obligation very seriously, and we are very responsible. We hold that with such high responsibility. I guess that's another thing that we're blessed with from our ancestors, that we still have that. No matter how hard life gets, how hard a society gets, we persevere. We are resilient. The photos here are from what we call the Sunrays collection. And the fellow holding the rifle is our great grandfather, Joe Thomas. And he was leading a delegation of folks through the Indian River Valley. They were looking for a way to bring a power line through there. And the bottom one is our late paternal grandfather, Ernie George, and he is in a dugout canoe, and that's a work canoe. So he's on the Indian River, where my Uncle Herb was, you saw in the title slide, and they're going up, we go up to Indian River to harvest chum and pink salmon, and the way we preserve it is through smoking it to carry us through the winter. But I love this photo because it reminds me of a story actually it was our dad told us about our gran. So our dad was about 8 years old, and he couldn't remember why he was the only one, because he has 3 other brothers, but he was the only one with his parents up in the Indian River. They had gone up there to do some fishing, and so they had a loaded canoe, and they were coming back down the river, and they hit a snag. So our grandfather tells our gran to get in the bow of the canoe while he's pulling them down, and he says, "And when I say, you jump to the back." And me, I'm just a little kid, and our gran at that time, she might have been in her 50s or 60s, so I'm thinking of her in this story as that old. So I'm thinking, wow. So when they came to the snag, he says, "Okay, jump." So she had to jump over our dad and the fish and to the bow of the canoe, and then they just went up and over the snag like that. But, it's just just those kinds of things that make it real, because we never had that experience. By the time I was born, our dad and his generation had to get into the wage economy, so they had to get jobs that were off the reserve and earning money so that we could survive. Next slide, please. And Leah, if you have anything to add, just jump in, okay? So we're talking about also what our gift is. And we know that, we've learned that we know when our environment is healthy, our communities are healthy. And we're getting there as Tsleil-Waututh people. There was a decade or there for a while that, everyone was clean and sober in the community, and we were all healthy and people were thriving. We're doing pretty good still. Our community is growing. Of the 600 people, at least half live on the reserve these days. And we've built up our administration, our health, our education, our ECDEV. We're doing fairly well. So that photo, again, is a photo of Uncle Herb up in the Inner River helping himself to a feast of berries. And the important thing about the ability to harvest is we don't have that opportunity much anymore. And so part of our work has always been trying to get our environment back to that state where it may not be able to sustain us, but we could have access to more traditional foods. The little photo or the logo on the bottom is a logo that I believe Leonard was chief at the time when we signed the MOU with the district on Waututh. Or was that you? Okay. But prior to Leah being chief and getting us that MOU, Leonard had commissioned his nephew Damien to do this logo. So that's a logo we have for some of the artwork down at Waututh at Kate's Park. And it's the deer and the ravens. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so this just speaks to a bit about, pre-contact. We lived in a seasonal round. We wintered at Tsleil-Waututh, which means biggest place for the people. Currently, it's called Belcarra. So our people would live there in shed-style longhouses. It was the best place to be because it was best sheltered for the harsh winters that were there, that we had back then. And also, there was a really excellent kind of lookout point in case, some of the enemies were coming up the inlet and coming up toward the river, that we could see them away. And so, you're spending months in confined spaces. So by the time spring comes around, we all dispersed to various spring and summer villages around the inlet, and then we begin that cycle of harvesting, of preparing for the harsh winter to come along again. Because, I'm a teacher by trade, and I would share with the kids, it was important to do that. We had to do that because we didn't have, Save on Foods or Safeway or a superstore to go get our food. So where did we have to get our food? And, the kids are really smart and they figure things out real quick. Then in the summer, we would journey down to the Fraser River to harvest sockeye, as sockeye do not come up the Burrard Inlet or Indian River. It's too small. So our people would head down there for the sockeye season, harvest what we need, come back home, and then head up to Indian River in the fall, where we harvest the chum and the pink. And the way we preserve it was smoke. So we'd have smoke houses up there, and families would be up there preparing for the winter. Next slide, please. Another thing we did when we were in those summer villages is we'd harvest from the inlet. So one of our teachings is when the tide went out, the table was set. And again, it's a great teaching to get children talking about. I'd say, so what does that mean? What does that mean the table is set when the tide goes out? And they talk about all the different seafood that we could get from the marine waters. And these photos, the top photo is our late Uncle Alfred, one of our grandfathers, one of his older brothers, and he's harvesting clams down on his beach. And you see all the white in the background? Those are barnacles. I bet you if we went down there today, it would just all be brown because of the pollution. So that other photo is actually me with our gran. I don't know, maybe I was 10, 11, 12 years old, but our gran had 9 grandchildren. And, more often than not, she had 6 or 7 of us. And so she'd take us out onto the mud flats and taught us how to dig clams and catch crab. But I like to tease myself. I was a real little princess, and I refused to learn how to catch a crab. Because she'd tell us, you just look for, lumps in the seaweed, and you just go over there and put your foot on it, and then you can grab your crab. And I thought, nope. All I could picture was a crab, pinching my toes. So I'm sure some of our cousins learned how to harvest crab, but I didn't. I know how to find clams, though. And but unfortunately, at that time, that was in the early 70s, shellfish harvesting was banned on the Burrard Inlet because of the pollution. We couldn't harvest the shellfish anymore. We still harvest crab, although, according to our Uncle Herb back then, he said they're smaller and the shells are softer. We do have an invasive clam that has come into the inlet, and I finally brought my grandchildren down to the beach a lot during this COVID time, and they're a purple varnish clam. So I was asking our TLR biologists, so how do we get rid of it? We'll figure out a way. And another thing that we have done as Tsleil-Waututh Nation, we have found an area on the inlet that we will keep secret, and we've harvested clams from there about 3 or 4 years in a row. And I know the first few years there was so much that there wasn't enough for everybody's, but we had a feast and people came by and we had our first feed of clams together in 30, 40, 50 years kind of thing. Yeah. So we are working on that.
One of the things to note is that when the tide, as Carleen said, when the tide went out, the table was set. There was the opportunity for Tsleil-Waututh to harvest 5 different kinds of clams and crabs and sea urchin and kelp and seagrass. It was an abundance. And today, as Carleen said, it doesn't exist. We can still crab because crabs are on top of the muck and they have an internal filtering system that clams do not, which is why we will harvest from that one spot and not from these areas that we traditionally harvested. And that all comes down to our Section 35 rights. I mean, every Indig person knows what Section 35 is, part of the Constitution that recognizes Aboriginal rights and title. We have the right for food, social, and ceremonial food. Well, we have that Aboriginal right, but we can't harvest. So what does that mean? I don't want my Section 35 protected rights by the highest law in the land to be an empty right, which is why Tsleil-Waututh does the remediation and rehabilitation that we can do. But it's not something that Tsleil-Waututh can do by itself. I mean, you only have to think about the Trans Mountain Expansion pipeline and what that has the potential to bring. The increased tanker traffic, the assured possibility of spills happening, and that there isn't enough science to show that they can clean it up or they can get it all. What we do know is that it will sink. That diluted bitumen will sink after a certain number of hours. So our already impacted inlet is going to be impacted even more. If Tsleil-Waututh exercises our free, prior and informed consent to say no to the Trans Mountain Expansion pipeline, that's great. But the federal government comes along and they buy the pipeline and they make it of national interest, which is trumping our, oh, I know that's bad, which is overriding our Section 35 protected Aboriginal rights. Where's the balance there? Where's the reconciliation that we've heard so much about since 2015? If this is the most important relationship to Prime Minister Trudeau, then I suggest he make it so.
Thanks, Leah. Next slide, please. Yay! Okay, so I just show this as it was one of our first maps that we created from the traditional land use studies that Leah and the team did. And Mike George was our, he was being mentored to start working in the GIS with GIS systems. And so this is just a map of all the traditional foods that all the Tsleil-Waututh people had harvested at some point in their lives from our homelands and waters. And what really surprised me as a young kid, I never even dreamed of eating sea urchins, even though our grandma told us stories about how they would harvest them and how they would eat them. And I think another thing that surprised me was the octopus. I still don't. I haven't tried it. But again, it's like Leah was saying, we have all this access, but it's not there, or that ability to know that was stolen from our parents we just never got to carry out fulfilling our own rights. Next slide.
But the big point there is that the resource doesn't exist. The resource doesn't exist in a way that we could harvest it. There are still clams growing down the beach, but they're polluted, so we can't eat them. That's the big take-home point, is that the resource that our Aboriginal right to harvest does not exist.
And that speaks also to the point of, how much work has gone on in the inlet, not just by Tsleil-Waututh, but other people as well, because in the last couple of cycles, the herring have come back to the inlet once, where the herring was a huge industry just after contact, and they fished it all out, and I haven't had any herring. Our grandmother taught us that they used to just lower hemlock branches into the water, and the herring would spawn on the branches, and that's how our ancestors were able to harvest that. So the important work that we do is just trying to make space for those resources to come back, because that's our obligation. That's our responsibility to continue that work our grandparents and parents tried to do. As I said, we did have to move into this economy. The photo on the right is actually our grandfather and his brothers and brother-in-law. They had a little logging company, I guess, and her sons had a shake mill down on the beach, and our grandfather and his brothers would log. I'm not too sure if they sold them to other folks as well, besides doing the shake mill. But on the log, sitting down in the very back, is our Grandpa Ernie, and the man standing is their older brother, Uncle Patty, or Herbert J. George. The one sitting in front of him is their brother-in-law, Andrew Jack from the Seashelt, and he was married to their oldest sister, Maya, or Madeline. And then the fellow right in the front is Chief Jan George. And this is one of the trees they had harvested back in the day somewhere on the North Shore. And we just used that photo on the left from the North Van Archives just as, scale to show how huge these trees were back in those days. And I'm thinking that that's probably in the maybe late 20s, early 30s, Leah. So we did find a way. We did find a way to take care of ourselves by moving into these different industries and way of being in the wage economy. Nope. Next. I think you've heard many stories about the impacts of colonization. I think what I take away most about it is, I've heard my sister Leah speak before, is that we don't stay bitter. We don't get paralyzed by that anger, by that trauma. We pick ourselves up and we just keep on doing the best we can with what's there in front of us or around us or beside us. With all that terrible loss, it would just be easy to give up, but our people did not. And that's another gift that they've given us. This photo is a branch of our Thomas family tree taken up at one of the cabins in the Indian River. On the far left is Frank Thomas, and his little brother in the middle is Dennis, and then their sister Emma is on the right. And when I first started showing this to school kids, I felt really weird about, showing them kids holding guns, holding rifles, but I share that it was such a natural thing that they were taught safety from a really young age, and this was just part of what they were going to grow into, learning how to hunt and be respectful for those animals that our people were hunting that would sustain ourselves. The prohibition of just who we are as human beings is just devastating. And I remember sharing this slideshow with immigrants that were just learning English. So what I would say to them is, for some reason you have left your country or your people have left your country. Why? Because it was too hard. You didn't agree with what's going on there. And you come to Canada, you look to Canada as a safe haven. Well, guess what? That's what happened to you. That's what we're going through here. Only it's not out there. It's not out in the news. It's not out in the public. It's kind of like, oh, that's just history. Just sweep it under the rug and get over it. Well, we're here to say that this is something and our history counts. Our history matters. And maybe it's incumbent upon all of us on how we overcome those systems of oppression. And we can start by doing that here in our own front yard. Next, please. I think we're showing this slide just to show just the size and the scope of, that's us, IR number 3. That's our reserve. That's where we were placed when they first started putting Indians on reserves. And, right across the inlet from us is that huge metropolis of a beautiful city called Vancouver. And we're in one of the richest, cities on the North Shore. West Vancouver is just to the west of us. Leah, did you have anything to add to this slide?
What is really dramatic is the change in what happened to our land and to the amount of land that we're placed upon. So we went from 1,150 square kilometers of land to 240 square hectares, something like that. When the Indian Reserve Commission came around, it was 1869, and our reserve was set aside. At that time, at least, we didn't get moved off our territory like they did in the United States. But at that time, 1869, there were so many things still available to our people that we weren't confined to that little Indian reserve. We still went out and did that seasonal round. We still harvested. We still went up to the Indian River to harvest salmon to smoke. We still went to the Fraser River to harvest sockeye. We still had clams and crab and all of the other things that were available to us on the beach and in the inlet. So in 1869, it wasn't confining. But as the industrial pollution became more and urban sprawl occurred, we are confined. Today we are confined. Even if we could hunt ducks, they probably wouldn't taste good. And we couldn't be shooting around because we're surrounded. Where I live in our community, across the 10-foot right-of-way is where the Juanitan people live in my community. They're actually noisy. No, I'm just kidding.
They're always building something. Next slide, please. Okay, so I shared with you how after our winter we'd disperse out to our variety of our spring and summer villages. This map shows actually the, I guess, registered sites, registered with the BC Archaeology Office. And I also like to share with this slide that Tsleil-Waututh has built a really good relationship with Simon Fraser University and the archaeology department. So if you look at, I think it's the bottom right, I think that's where Port Moody is, and it's called St. Maumet. We did a field school there in the early 2000s, and as a practice, as a traditional practice, we make sure that the archaeologic students have access to our elders, to our knowledge keepers. So we brought our parents out there once they started the dig, just to interact with them, and for the students to get to know some of the Tsleil-Waututh people who they're studying. But the story I like to share about the name of this place. So after I graduated university in 2003, I went to work for the Burnaby School District. And at that time, they were building a brand new high school, and they were considering putting a First Nations name to it. So I went to our grandfather and said, this is what they're thinking of doing, Dad. What do you think? Do you have any names for them? Do we have any names in Burnaby area that you could think of? And I guess he told me this name, St. Maumet. And I said, oh, does it have a meaning? I got really excited. And he said, he kind of chuckled, and you know how Dadam chuckles when he's got something cheeky to say. He said, I don't know, maybe we shouldn't. I said, why? What does it mean? And he goes, the lazy ones. And I went, oh my gosh, yeah, how come they were called that? And I guess in his mind he was going to the village in Port Moody, because what we found out when we brought our parents to Port Moody, they were telling us all the rich finds. There were, remains of all kinds of animals and sea creatures, and what struck one of the ethnobotanists, she was struck by the diversity of plant life that they were, the remains of plant life that they were finding. And one of them just said, they probably just walked out their door and there was their food. So I thought, oh, that's why. I guess, they were poking fun at their relatives, but they were calling them the lazy ones. And Tumtmeochtin at Belcara means biggest place for the people. Huayawichin, Kate's Park, means facing the wind. So if you ever go to Kate's Park, anywhere in the park, you can probably feel a little breeze on yourself, just because it's right on that point. Next slide, please. Oh, actually, I forgot to tell you, Reed Point, we did another field school there just recently, and we took our parents there, and the lead archaeologist at the time was, telling us what they were finding, a lot of shell midden, a lot of clams, like processed clams. So it was a village where our people actually processed the clams for winter keeping. And so he was feeling kind of down about it because he wasn't finding the big, shiny, spearhead or tools, right? Things that I guess guys look for, I don't know. And they also found, he called it an oven, where it was a place our women had processed berries, and they did a test and they knew they were elderberries. And so it made me think of the story our grand told us. You know, back in the day, they would gather the berries, they would process them, lay them flat to dry, and when they were dried, they'd roll them up and put them away for the winter. And she'd say, so technically, we invented the first fruit roll-up. Now kids, you know, my kids' age got that, but kids these days, they kind of don't get it. Anyway, Morgan, who was the archaeologist, he was feeling really down that it to him this site wasn't very exciting. And I said, no, you got to look at it this way. This is a grandmother's site. This is where we learn what our grandmothers did, our matriarchs did from time out of mind. The other amazing find they found there was a cairn. And one of the other archaeologists who was there is apparently an expert in Coast Salish cairns, and he couldn't believe how huge it was. And so, and they didn't know what to do. They didn't know if they should start, you know, processing it or going through it. And my dad and I looked at each other, and Dad said, nope. He said, we know what it is. So I can't recall if I shared in the beginning, our population was decimated by a pandemic called smallpox. And our grandparents have told us that, and sometimes it was just so bad that our relatives from Squamish and Musqueam had to help come and help bury the dead. So we knew that this must have been one of those places that had happened. And the archaeologists there respected that, and they just left that spot alone. Yeah. Another important story to our people is about Tsleil-Waututh, the double-headed serpent. And Jesse Morin did a lot of work for us in helping our strength of claim for the treaty process. And actually, Jesse is the only one expert in that field, I guess, in rock paintings that we've allowed to do any publishing. So if you want to learn anything about Tsleil-Waututh, you Google us and you'll find Jesse's articles. I think they're in 2 journals. He worked with another fellow, and they were talking about rock paintings and what they have learned. You know, Coast Salish rock paintings are very different from other rock paintings you might be familiar with. But the oral history about Tsleil-Waututh is, it was this 2-headed serpent had blocked the fresh water from people at Tumtmeochten. And so one of our young men was groomed and taught and trained to take out this serpent. And so his story is told through the paintings that at some of the sites that you can see on the map that they had discovered rock paintings. Interesting story about that too is I guess it was in the early 90s when Leonard was first our chief. Harcourt NDP became the government of the day, and I guess he thought he was doing really good work, and he was going to make this Indian Arm Park into a provincial park, but it happened, just coincided with one of that court case that they're supposed to consult, Delgamuukw court case. And so, you know, Chief Leonard gets this invitation from the Premier's office, oh, come join us, we're going to launch this news that we're going to make this a provincial park and stuff. And I happened to be on council at the time, and Leonard says, I wonder if I should show up with an injunction. And we all laughed, yeah, we should. And so he gave the Premier the option, either we show up with an injunction or you work with Tsleil-Waututh. And so he decided to work with Tsleil-Waututh, and we co-manage the Indian Arm Park. And just recently, I think maybe within the last 3-4 years, it's actually officially called, we called it Tsleil-Waututh, which means Land of the Serpent. And I've learned recently that that's the official title of the park now. So, thanks. Next slide. Okay, yeah, so this kind of speaks to, what I had shared that I've heard my sister speak about before. We don't stay in bitterness. We don't get paralyzed by that anger or that fear. We just keep on. And Tsleil-Waututh has been doing that for as long as I can remember. It may not be the hot topic words that we use now, like climate change and climate adaptation, but we've been talking about that for decades, for generations. And now it's finally coming around where there are a lot more people who understand what we've been trying to say that long ago. We've known, like I said, for generations, the impact of human beings on our resources, and try to stop it or try to say, hey, we need to be doing this differently. And so that's what Tsleil-Waututh does. We try and help people figure out you can develop, you can benefit from the lands, but we need to be smart about it. We need to be sustainable, and sustainable to us may not be the same as sustainable to you, so we need to figure that out. So we just need to get all at the same table and talk about these things, and that's what Tsleil-Waututh does. Next. I love this photo. I tell people, when we got into the treaty process, I think it was in 93 or 94, 95, there's 6 stages to this treaty process. And we got to stage 4 just like that. Like within years, we were at stage 4 and we couldn't go any farther. But what struck me was, we always met in boardrooms or ballrooms in hotels, and we didn't feel like we were getting anywhere. And then this one time we decided, you know what? We need to get these negotiators out on the land so they can actually be immersed in the feeling that we're trying to convey about why it's so important to protect the water, why it's so important to protect the habitat for the salmon, for the forests, for, all the flora and fauna. And so we arranged to take them up to the Indian River Valley. And our dad is there standing, pointing his arm out. I'm pretty sure we're at one of the deep holes where they would catch the chum or the pink. And those are the negotiators. They're listening to him. Unfortunately, as with all things government, there's just always turnovers. The people change. We were fortunate in having Deb on the feds for a real long time. We're on a pause. We've been on a pause with the treaty process for a real long time because it's not getting us any further. And Tsleil-Waututh, in our leadership, we're getting better without the treaty process, kind of, than being stuck in it. We can't stay still. Things keep moving and evolving, so we need to keep up.
What I think about the treaty process is that Tsleil-Waututh joined because it was the only option available. We were able to borrow money, and yeah, it was terrible to have to borrow money, but we borrowed money and we built capacity. All that we've created and generated a number of atlases that talk about our territory, about things like the bathymetry. Before we did that, I had no idea what bathymetry is. It's what the geography looks like underwater. We have maps about everything in our territory, including Tsleil-Waututh Indian Arm Provincial Park. We know more about our land than any government ever will. We know our side of the history, And we also know the geography. We also know precipitation. We also know what grows there. We know everything. And we were only able to do that because we borrowed money. We built capacity, and that was one of our goals. When we decided to go into the treaty process, we talked about what are the building blocks that we're going to need. Well, we'll need a constitution. We'll need bioregional mapping, which is the style of mapping that we've done with Terry Tobias. And we'll also need capacity. If we ever got to a final agreement, we would need people who could hit the ground running. We need people who know how to run a government. So Michael George is one of our examples. When he first joined us, he sold cigarettes at the front desk. That was his job. And then he became a mapper, and he did these kinds of presentations with me back in the day when I was in TLR, and now he's higher up in TLR, and he's like Carleen. They're like our Tsleil-Waututh resource people. So say what you want about the treaty process. We knew going in that we didn't want to repay that loan. So everything that the First Nation Summit organization did to ensure that we wouldn't have to, Tsleil-Waututh Nation supported. And I'm happy to say that the First Nation Summit, the First Nations themselves, had been in discussions with the province and the federal governments around non-repayment of the loans. And it took 25 years, but last year it was official that no First Nation would have to repay the loans that they took down entering the BC treaty process. But it went further than that. It would reimburse First Nations like the Niska Nation, who had their agreement in 2001. And it also would include the treaties that were negotiated more modern day in the eastern part of Canada. So while the treaty process is one tool in the basket, it isn't the only one. And at least it helped us build the capacity that we have sitting here today. When I first started at Tsleil-Waututh in 1992, in 1992, I was one of 8 people that worked in the office. Today we have over 150 with seasonal. We had 8 people, including the chief and the guy who sold cigarettes at the front desk. That's what we had. And we're able to build the capacity where we built a GIS mapping office that helps other First Nations, that now has spun off into a business, part of our Tsleil-Waututh business, where they do mapping for anybody that needs mapping, including other First Nations. So I think there is still some hope for the treaty process. They're working on things right now, but Tsleil-Waututh has a lot of other things going on. I mean, you know us from the news. We're the ones that say no to Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline. Well, as a result of that, there are some other things that are negotiations that are going on as well. So, I mean, we'll see where it goes and how it goes. And just know that for Tsleil-Waututh, this still could be a tool. But we're not there exactly yet. We're just thanking Creator that we don't have to pay back a bunch of money.
That's right. A lot of our people are thankful for that as well. All right, next, please. So this Sacred Trust Initiative was born from Tsleil-Waututh's decision to oppose Kinder Morgan expansion project. And like what had happened was one of our cousins came to the chief and council of the day with all the information. I think that was in 2011. And we turned him around and said, okay, you need to get us all the information that you can. And we figured out, the pros and cons of this project and the impacts or benefits that would come to the nation. And so we gathered all the people at the gym. We had a feast. We had these presentations. TWN members were able to ask questions of the team that put the presentation together and of leadership of the day. And then we put it to the people. What would you like us to do as leadership, as chief and council? What are we to do? And it was a resounding no. We need to stand up against this project because it's not a matter of if a spill or a catastrophe happens, it's when. When will it happen? And with all of the, like Leah was saying, all the capacity that we have built within our nation, we were able to do our own assessment of the project. And when you think about assessments, they assess on how much more stress resources can take. We looked at it, and we looked at it from a different point of view. And that view is how much can, it's not so much as how much it can take and how much that we need to protect it. So we partnered with the City of Burnaby, the District of North Vancouver, and did oil spill projections, on various different tides and various different scenarios. I can't remember how long our assessment was. I think it's over 1,000 pages, and you can actually Google the Sacred Trust Initiative and have access to that assessment there. But what's important for me about starting this initiative, and it's much like we have taken our own way of doing things back. Before we do any big important work, we do ceremony. And after we do important work, we do ceremony again to honor those that stood for us in being our voices. So the photo on the left is actually from one of our initial ceremonies. We worked with the Squamish and Musqueam people, and we did our own kind of tribal journey. We had ocean-going canoes start at Ambleside and make their way over to Kate's Park to Whayawachin. Before the canoes came to the beach, we had medicine people out on the water, and they did the first water ceremony that we have known in living memory. It was an amazing time. And again, you'll find some of those photos and maybe even some video on our website. And that's just a capture, I don't know, maybe from one of the news outlets that captured that image, which is so important. The other one is, the other photo is our Takaya Tours, our own ecotourism company that we have. We've never really made money from it, but the important thing is it's teaching people about Tsleil-Waututh, who we are and where we've been and where we feel the obligation to protect our homelands and waters. I don't know, Leah, if you want to talk about the court cases a little bit.
In 2000, I think it was 2007, when they were doing some excavation around the pipeline itself, and one of the heavy machinery poked a hole. And I don't know if you remember, or if you were here in Burnaby, this bitumen came spouting out. It was crazy. It went all over houses. Our brother was in Deep Cove area, and he came out of the bank and he could smell it. Our dad, who lives on the water, he could smell it too. And they're like, what the heck? We can smell oil. What's going on? So by the time the oil got to the water, we had people on the ground in Burnaby monitoring what the reaction of the different levels of government, what they were doing. And it happened on a Wednesday. I was chief then, and I was in Winnipeg, and they phoned me and they let me know what was happening. So I was handling media from Winnipeg. By the time we met with then Kinder Morgan on Monday, we had maps of where that oil went. We could show them on maps on that day on Monday where their bitumen was impacting our resources on the beach. And without having that GIS, we wouldn't have been able to do it. So in the cleanup, we didn't do the cleanup. Well, we had our people on the water that were shepherding, well, they were taking them around on boats, the ones that were, catching the waterfowl that they had to clean or trying to clean up on other places. We kept people at on site in Burnaby for 17 days straight because we wanted to make sure that we understood what was happening, and we wanted to be able to keep the governments accountable for the cleanup. So that's even before the whole expansion project began. If we're in an era of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, at that time, that wasn't actually applicable in Canada. They weren't thinking about it. When we decided to say no, we needed to go to court, and we did. And we stayed in court for a number of years with injunctions to say no, that the consultation didn't happen the way that the government promised it would happen. They didn't hear us. They didn't listen. They just came and took notes. So we won in 2018, and they had to come back to the table to negotiate, to talk with us again, but they still couldn't hear us. And then they won. And then we wanted to go to the Supreme Court of Canada. So and you have to ask the court, can we come to you with this issue? You have to tell them what your issue is, and you have to show all the evidence you have from your court cases before. And the Supreme Court of Canada said no. And to be fair, Supreme Court of Canada doesn't hear everybody. 10% of the cases that come forward, they hear. So it was really disappointing for us. So our litigation piece on that consultation is over. There isn't any more relief for us to seek at the court on that issue. So Tsleil-Waututh is considering what our next steps can be. We remain opposed to Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline, and we're considering, and we'll be taking it to our community for approval before we share anything in addition. But our people are still adamant that we stand against it because of the impact that will happen to an already impacted area. We already can't practice all of our Section 35 highest law of the land Aboriginal rights. We already can't do that. And they want to bring all of these tankers in, and we don't know, for example, we don't know the threshold level of noise that the southern resident killer whale can withstand. It could be we've already surpassed it, but we don't know. There's not enough science. And we've said that to Canada. You need to know this because southern resident killer whale is protected by the Species at Risk Act. That's a federal piece of legislation. So the federal government should know whether or not it's breaching in breach of its own legislation. But it's all about the interest, the public interest, national interest. So that's where we are at it.
Yeah, I'm looking at the time and realizing how
it's
quickly.
it's so hard.
Yeah,
This
and
is
I
like
think
the worst part in this position is because protocol is like you talk until you're finished, but we're on this linear time thing, and I just want to. How many? Ooh, I mean, of course, I want to open it to questions, but I don't think we have enough time. I don't think we do. We don't.
no, and the rest of the slides just we've already touched on a lot of it. The protocol agreements that we have with various levels of governments, the municipal, the province. So yeah, I think we've covered everything. Yeah.
I think I just want to thank you for that because, I mean, there's so much there. I have 1,000 questions. I was like, hang on a second, let's look at the map again, and because I'm so curious to the space, and so, and I think you brought up a really good point about how there are all these laws and policies, and how is it, and they're empty because they're not actually in, even though that's what the law says, or Section 35, the list goes on of all the different things, royal, I can't even name them all, but there's a lot to say don't do that. You have to have informed consent, and yet we live in like this monster that puts profit and over people. What would be a request for all of the settlers here, and that's a bigger picture, to in honoring that this is the territory that we're on? What is it that you call for people?
I think if you love this land, if you love this water, this area that you call home in Vancouver, then you say no to the Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline. You say no, OCM. And you stand. And you stand with Tsleil-Waututh. You stand with Squamish. You stand with all of the Indigenous people here in this land against it. And I think if there are enough voices, that will help. I think there might be things coming along that might help us, like there's going to be new federal legislation for implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Mm-hmm. And they say that it's going to be applying to things that have already happened. We do know that in the latest Supreme Court decision that came down in Tsleil-Waututh, the Williams case, that the judge said, and even after a project is complete and it is found that there wasn't free, prior, and informed consent, that project can be rolled back. So I mean, there are still those kinds of things. But the biggest thing is to say no. I mean, I always joke and say, if you can't save the Indians, save the southern resident killer whale. For God's sake, let's keep the whales. And I think that's really what's gonna help. I did an interview with a radio station that asked me what did it mean that killer whale mom carried the dead baby on her head for 17 days. What did that mean? And I said, hello, that was a message. That was a message telling all of you that this is what's going to happen. We're going to lose them as a resource. How can you not see that mother carrying her dead child on her head is not a message? And then he kind of got embarrassed. But it really is. It's showing us what's coming and what are we going to do about it. We have to do something.
Thank you. I think we're at the end of our time. Is that right?
Oh, I can only echo my sister's words. I think, as a citizen, and it's so hard to do these days in COVID, but we've had a lot of rallies here in Vancouver, and those really amplify the voices. So I think we need to find another way to amplify our voices together. When I speak to people, I say, you know, we're all like a choir. You know, a choir has different voices, the bass, the tenor, the alto, the soprano, and they sing harmony and they sing melody. And that's what we all are. We are all that choir. And our voices will ring or sound. Well, we're singing the same message, but it's coming in a different way. So finding a way through your own connections, through your own circles, in standing shoulder to shoulder with Indigenous peoples. Because another one of our teachings and one of our messages is this isn't just for us. You know, we're highlighting what the highest law of the land says, but we're doing it for you as well and for your generations to come. Because where can we go? You know, Tsleil-Waututh isn't going to go anywhere. We have nowhere to go. When that accident happens, we have nowhere to go. Other people can pick up and move, but we can't. Our obligation is to hear. Our obligation is to our children and to our grandchildren and to our grandchildren's grandchildren. So finding a way that works for you in helping to support the fight that we all need to fight.
I just think, I just want to say this because I think this is an important piece in the work I'm doing right now. I often ask all the organizations and different institutions, what is the original laws and values, the constitutions of the land that you're on? And I think that's a really important piece for people to learn the constitution of your laws. And I think that's a really important piece that so it's not just you learning that, but people here. So it's like we embody that same relationship, you know? And I think that's a real, you know, because what is that? And I'm not asking you right now because I know that's another big whole piece, you know? But I think it's a really, you know, it's homework for all of us, right? Of what are those laws?
I know you're coming to the end of your time. I just want to say that I think that Indigenous people in our communities, we're in a period of nation rebuilding. We all have to do that work. We all have to, in our communities, from that perspective, we have to think about, well, what was the law here? What did we say? What did we believe? We did that with the National Energy Board. When we went to say why we were saying no, our brother Gabriel, he laid out our oral history, and I laid out our law. That's what we all need to do. We all need to get to the point where, whether or not it's environmental or it's about children and families, you have laws in your community that speak to those issues, especially when we're coming to legislation that has been passed or has the potential to be passed, especially around children and families. There's a new federal piece of legislation around Indigenous children. I mean, you can apply your own Indigenous law to your own children and not have federal or provincial laws apply. I mean, that's empowering. And that's part of the rebuilding that we all have to do in our communities. And I wish us all well.
Thank you everyone for coming today. Thank you to Rosemary. Thank you to everybody else up there.
Donna, Alistair.
Yeah, Donna, Alistair, and Chris. Thank you to April, and thank you to all of you for coming, and especially you ones that are here for the long run. Been coming multiple times. It's been really beautiful to witness. Thank you, and thank you so much.
I feel really good about how things went today. I would like to sing us out with our Sahel song. I apologize, I didn't bring my drum or my rattle, but I could do it a cappella. We could do it a cappella. And the Sahel song is it's a well, it's kind of like a guessing game or a gambling game.
It's the bone game.
It's a bone game, it's a hand game. And when our late Uncle Len was bringing back our songs and our dances, he'd tell us that that's what it was a gambling game. But as we got older and as we got wiser, I guess he also said, we have to look at it as a game of chance. It's called taking a risk. So we're all taking a risk together. So, yeah. Okay.